What is up, Janksters? It's your boy Graham, also known as HamHawks42 on the internet, and today we are asking a very important question that ultimately you're going to need to decide the answer for you. But the question is it worth it to invest in Kamigawa Neon Dynasty Alchemy? These are 30 new cards that are being introduced to Arena that will only be legal in the Alchemy format and Historic. Now, if those formats are of interest to you, then you probably want to pay attention to this video. If those formats are not of interest to you at all, I'll tell you right now, it's probably in your best efforts, or in your best interest rather, to skip this one. These sets, these cards are only available in those formats, and they are going to take wild cards or the purchasing of packs through the store unless something changes between the recording of this video and their release, which is scheduled for tomorrow as of this recording. But what we are going to do is take a look at all 30 cards from Alchemy Kamigawa Neon Dynasty, or whatever they're calling this set, and do a set review for them. It'll take a look at all 30 cards to walk through where they could be useful, whether or not they are worth the rarity that Wizards has assigned them, and see ultimately if they make sense for you, to see if that's something that you would want to include in your decks. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started with the uncommons. We are going to start with the uncommons, the rares, and then the mythic rares. Now, if you may be wondering, these don't appear in common or in standard packs, so why do they have these rarities assigned to them? I don't know. At the end of the day, I don't know. You cannot buy a 15-pack booster pack of these. There are also none assigned the common rarity, which is an interesting detail. But anyway, we're not going to discuss the arena economy here. There are plenty of resources out there talking at length about that. For today, let's take a look at the cards themselves and see where we would want to use them. All right, so the card that we are starting with is Painful Bond. This is an instant for 1 and a black, draw 2 cards, then cards in your hand with mana value 3 or greater perpetually gain. When you cast this spell, you lose 1 life. There are a couple of things I note about this card. One life isn't really that much to spend. Also, it only hits when you actually play the spell. So as a result, a couple of things. There's no reason not to run this if you're running black in a couple of situations. If you're running aggro and you're willing to spend a little bit of life to achieve great things, then drawing a couple of cards is not a big deal. Or losing a little bit of life to draw cards, totally worth it. Go for it. If you're also playing in a deck where Luris is the companion, you're not allowed to have permanents that are over 2 CMC or 2 mana value anyway. So why not run this? There's very little reason to, because there's a decent chance that you're going to hit this on 2 at instant speed, mind you. So you can even hold up kill spells, and then if your opponent doesn't give you something to kill, you can then cast this at the end of the turn. Awesome. So this is going to be worth it 90% of the time. I would say as an uncommon, this one is great. Just do it. You don't get to draw 2 cards for 2 mana very often. That is a rare ability. The closest thing we've seen to this in standard right now is Expressive Iteration, and that requires 2 different colors, and it forces you to cast one of those spells this turn. Now, admittedly, with Painful Bond, if you're in a mid-range deck or a game or like a multicolor deck situation where you have a lot of three drops or above, it becomes significantly less valuable, because then all of a sudden that 1 life could be very, very meaningful, and losing that life every time you cast something could really hurt. Also, it's worth noting that this is perpetually gains. When you cast a spell, you lose 1 life, meaning you lose 1 life to cast a creature out onto the board. Say, let's say you're throwing down a 4-drop creature. Your opponent uses Fading Hope to bounce it back up to your hand. If you want to cast it again, you lose the life again. That hurts so badly. And keep in mind, this isn't a format where Divide by 0 is legal, so that's something that you really need to be aware of and really need to take note of. Also, if you're doing shenanigans where creatures are coming back to your hand from the graveyard, which is a mechanic that they do encourage in Alchemy, that perpetually is relevant there too. But all in all, for an uncommon, I think this is absolutely worth it. It's not a free roll jam in every black deck, but in certain black decks, it's absolutely great, because it is just draw 2 for 2. That's great. Like, I think this card is absolutely fantastic. And again, as an uncommon, definitely worth crafting, especially if you've been playing for Arena for a long time and you have a bunch of uncommon wild cards just lying around anyway. So yeah, give this one a shot. Next up, we have Kami of Bamboo Groves. This is a 1/1 enchantment creature spirit for 1. When Kami of Bamboo Groves enters the battlefield, you may put a land card from your hand onto the battlefield tapped. That effect for 1 mana is great, but it also has channel, 2 and a green, discard Kami of Bamboo Groves, conjure 2 cards named Forest into your hand. Now that channel ability isn't particularly great. However, this being a 1/1 for 1 that just straight ramps you on turn 1 by giving you an additional land drop. I mean, this is Arboreal Grazer, but it has power. It actually has a 1 power. So to be honest, I think Kami of Bamboo Groves is actually pretty good in some ramp decks. It's not bad in green decks. Green decks that have a high top end, so mid-range decks that include green or ramp decks like I mentioned, they're gonna want this card. I think it actually fits really nicely. And again, for uncommon, I think this is worth it. This is a very powerful card. And if you get it stuck in your hand late in the game and you don't have any other lands available, you can just channel it, get a couple forests. Also note, these are conjured forests, meaning that you're not pulling them out of your library, you are just creating them out of nothing. And these are 2 forest cards you get to put in your hand for free. They're not taking them out of the deck, they're not coming out of anywhere. So if you're a ramp deck that's running 26 or 27 lands, this gives you access to 29 or or 28, whatever the case may be. I think it's pretty cool. Like, Kami of Bamboo Groves is a meaningful, worthwhile card. It's also an enchantment, so you get Enchantress triggers if you're in Historic, and that's relevant. That's great. That's very, very useful. And it's a spirit, which may be a relevant creature type sooner or later. In green, not so much. It's more relevant in Azorius right now in the current meta. But it's a creature type that we do see support for, so that may be relevant at some point in the future as well. So Kami Bamboo Groves, definitely worth an uncommon craft, I think. This is also, to take all of these uncommon recommendations with a grain of salt, because you're talking to somebody who has like 300 uncommon wild cards and he doesn't know what to do with them all. Which is not an uncommon place to be. So if you find yourself in that position in Arena, feel free to crack these uncommons. I think they're definitely worth it. At least the ones we've seen so far. Next up, Experimental Pilot. This is a 1/1 human pilot with Ward 2 for 1 blue. 1/1 for 1, relevant creature types, so far looking good. And Ward 2 is no joke, so that's not quite hexproof, but in the early game, it might as well be. Pay 1 blue, discard 2 cards. That's a high cost. What do you get? Draft a card from Experimental Pilot's spellbook, and Experimental Pilot crews vehicles as though it had power 2 or greater. Now, Experimental Pilot's spellbook is full of vehicles, as you can imagine. Some of which are great, some of which not so much. So at the end of the day, I think personally, if this was discard 1 card, draft a card from the spellbook, awesome, absolutely fantastic. But in my opinion, and I may be proven wrong on this, I don't believe the cost of discarding 2 cards makes it worth the card selection that you get from the spellbook, especially because when you draft a card from a spellbook, you only get access to 3 of them chosen at random, and then you get to pick 1 of those. So you could hit 3 really lousy choices and be really sad and want those cards you discarded back. So unless you're in a situation where you have an embarrassment of riches as far as card draw is concerned, I really wouldn't consider running this personally for that ability. That said, it also has Experimental Pilot crews vehicles as though they had power 2 or greater. So in a situation where you're running main deck vehicles, it might be worthwhile. If you are considering putting this in your deck, I would disregard the discard 2 cards, draft a card from the spellbook ability. If a 1/1 with Ward 2 for 1 with no evasion or anything of that nature that can crew up to 3 is worth it for you, then put the card in your deck. If it's not, don't. And I think in a lot of situations, it's not going to be worth that unless you're doing some shenanigans with, like, I'm trying to think of good vehicles that are even worth it. And to be honest, I'm struggling because a Seeker's Chariot in Alchemy only crews for 2. So something like that, maybe a Simic situation where you're running a Seeker's Chariot, maybe. But even then, there are better options, I think, as far as pilots go. Yeah, I think Experimental Pilot is kind of a meh. This is like this is a C-level card. It's not bad for its mana cost. You get a lot of cool value, but none of it is amazing, if that makes sense. So I don't see this card having any particular homes, but I could be proven wrong on that. If a vehicle's deck proves to be successful in the meta, it proves to be successful in Alchemy, Experimental Pilot may have a home in that deck. But I'm not seeing it personally. We'll see. But this is the first uncommon that I gotta say I'm not really jazzed about. All right, next up, we have Dragonfly Pilot. So this is another pilot. It has the pilot ability where it can crew vehicles as though it had power 2 or greater. Awesome. And it is a 1/1 Fox Pilot for 1 white. And whenever Dragonfly Pilot enters the battlefield, conjure a card named Dragonfly Suit into your hand. Dragonfly Suit is it is a vehicle that showed up in Kamigawa Neon Dynasty that is meh. It is a lukewarm vehicle that is perfectly acceptable, but not great. And as a result, I think this card is, again, meh. It's just the Dragonfly Suit coming into your hand may be relevant in very aggressive decks where you want to have vehicles on the battlefield, or if you're trying to conjure like a Mech Titan, for example. If you're trying to make that happen, that dream, Dragonfly Pilot might have a home because it gives you a pilot creature that can crew the vehicle, and then it gives you the vehicle to crew. But is the vehicle worth it? Personally, I don't think so, but I could be wrong on that. Dragonfly Suit is one of those cards that when I read it first, here, actually, you know what? I'm gonna pull it up. This wasn't scripted, so Dragonfly Suit, it is a 3/2 flyer for 3 with crew 1. This looks like it should be a perfectly good artifact. It's a perfectly good vehicle. It should be fine, but it's just not quite there. Also, this pilot being able to crew up to 3 but giving you a vehicle that only crews for 1 seems like a missed opportunity. Like, why isn't this something that crews for 3? To be fair, if this conjured like a Reckoner Bankbuster into your hand or something like that, or a Surge Hacker mech, this would be way too powerful. Like, I get that, but at the end of the day, I just think this card is a big fat meh. I don't want to dedicate slots in my library or in my deck for this personally. If you are building a lot of stuff with vehicles, maybe there's something there for you. But all in all, although this is actually a very interesting case study comparing Dragonfly Pilot to the Experimental Pilot, because with the Experimental Pilot, you got the 1/1 for 1 with Ward 2, admittedly, but you had to discard 2 cards and spend mana in order to conjure up a vehicle. Dragonfly Pilot just gives you that, except the vehicle is mediocre at best. Whereas with the Experimental Pilot, you might get something good. Yeah, all in all, this one's probably not worth the crafted unless you're really hellbent on coming up with some type of Mech Titan shenanigans, or really insistent on trying to make vehicles work, because then it is a 1-drop pilot. And this basically could give you 8 hotshot mechanics in your deck. You can do worse than that in a vehicle-centric deck. You could do a lot worse than that. So maybe this is an enabler for that type of shell, but that's the only place where I could see it working. All right, next up, we have Artillery Enthusiast. So this uncommon suite is very, very low cost. I was about to say 1-drops because they're almost exclusively 1-drops with the exception of the black one. But anyway, this is Artillery Enthusiast. It's a 1/1 for 1 Goblin Artificer that says modified creatures you control have menace. Absolutely fantastic. You love to see it. When Artillery Enthusiast enters the battlefield, you may discard a card. If you do, seek a card with mana value equal to that card's mana value. This is interesting. This is very interesting. Now, Seek is a mechanic where you dig through your library and pull something up. So as a result, if you're running multiples of whatever you discarded, you may, if I'm reading this correctly, just seek up another copy of the thing you just discarded, which thins your library a little, I guess, but that's about all it would do. Otherwise, you have an opportunity to hit something else in your library that is of the same mana value. I think this is an interesting design, and it also gives you that Seek ability right out the gate. So if you have a situation where you have a particular... Actually, the one area where I can really see this being valuable is if you have channel creatures or channel spells. So for example, you could discard a card. You could discard a land. Like, you could discard a basic mountain to this, and you might seek up... because the mana value there is 0. So you could seek up a card like Sukenzin, the legendary red land that can create spirit tokens. Now, it's a crapshoot because you may just hit in one of your other lands, but if you have a high volume of good utility lands and fewer basic lands, that's a possibility. That's kind of neat. Okay, there's something there maybe. Otherwise, you can trade 1 3-drop or 1 4-drop for another, and you can do that as quickly as turn 1. So it gives you an opportunity to smooth your hand out a little bit and possibly trade in a 3-mana creature that's a good late game payoff for a 3-mana ramp spell that you might need to get there. I don't know, something like that. There's a possibility. So I think Artillery Enthusiast is interesting. It's the kind of thing that gets my mind going, that gets me... I want to find a way to make this work. And on top of that, if nothing else, just discounting the ETB trigger, modified creatures you control have menace. I like that. I like that a lot. A blanket statement like that on a card like this is fantastic, because any creature with an aura, any creature with an equipment, or any creature with a counter all of a sudden has menace. That is incredibly powerful, especially in a modified archetype in a world where the Invigorating Hot Spring and Thundering Raiju, Luminarch Aspirant, I mean, the number of counters and modifications that are flying around out there is, I mean, they're everywhere. So it's very easy to modify an entire board, and in so doing, give them all menace. I think that's great. So Artillery Enthusiast, probably worth the craft as well. All right, next up, let's see, what do we got? We have Undercity Plunder. This is our first rare that we are taking a look at, and this is a sorcery for 1 and a black. Now, I gotta be honest, so 1 and a black, the spells at 1 and a black have a lot to live up to, because that first one was pretty fantastic. So let's see what this one does. And this is at rare. So this is a rare, this would be a rare wild card or a lucky draw in a pack. But anyway, target opponent discards a card. Then they may discard an additional card. If they don't, conjure a duplicate of a random card from their library into your hand. It perpetually gains. You may spend mana as though it were a mana of any color to cast a spell. So this looks like half a Skull Raid with a weird alchemy coating to it, and I kind of love that. So the card is really interesting. So your opponent has to discard 1, but they get to choose what it is. So, okay, that's fine. For 2 mana, that's a little pricey for that. However, you have an opportunity to Mind Drain them for only 2. That effect usually costs 3. And so to get that effect where they have to discard 2 cards for 2 mana, even at sorcery speed, that's pretty darn good. So that's actually pretty fantastic. But if they do not do that, so what's the cost for them? You have an opportunity to draw a random card from their library, which could be anything. That could be a land, that could be a creature, that could be their Discover the Formula, their Hullbreaker Horror. It could be anything. I'm just, you know, absolutely anything from their library. And if you are in a situation where you need to hit your land drops, conjuring a land from their library sounds great. If you're in a situation where you really, I mean, a lot of times actually in the current meta, we have mid-range being dominant, which means there are a lot of just really good cards running around. So if you can conjure up a copy of a City Stalker Connoisseur, if you can conjure up a copy of a Fable of the Mirror Breaker, or simply a kill spell when you need it, or for when you need it, because this goes to your hand. You can cast it whenever. It's a new card in your hand. You draw 1, but it's a random card from their library. I think in a mid-range meta, this is especially good. It really incentivizes your opponent to discard that additional card, which can hurt them really badly. So in a deck that's running cards like Virus Beetle, it's running cards like, I mean, good old Elder Fang Disciple and those types of things, to really monkey with their hand, this could slot into those style decks that run Turgid, for example, very, very efficiently and very, very well. So in a controlling deck that is running black, Undercity Plunder could actually fit really nicely into those kind of shells. It also gives your opponent a bit of a quandary, which I love. I think giving them the question of, okay, do I want to discard that additional card, or do I want to give them a card? Because, note, this is digital only. You conjure a duplicate of a card in their library. They don't lose the card. You just get one too. But it's not revealed. So you get to conjure up a random card. Your opponent doesn't get to see what it is. They have no idea what you took. And they won't have an idea unless you play it, which is really cool. So if you steal a land from them, you just get to sit on it and hold it, which is, I think, is fascinating. I love that. Also, if they're running a similar deck than yours, unless Arena shows it in their sleeve in your hand, I don't think they will have any way of knowing what card it was that you took from them. Unless, obviously, if you're playing a mono black deck and you play a copy of Fable in the Mirror Breaker, obviously they'll see it and they'll know. But if you pull up a copy of Undercity Plunder from their library and you hit them with it again, they don't know that it's the one that you took it from them. Anyway, I find that fascinating. I think this card is interesting. Is it worth the wild card, though? That is the question that really matters. And I think if you are trying to make a controlled deck with either Black or Esper or Grixis work, and a hand disruption is already part of your game plan, then I think it's worth a consideration. If you have a deck where you have considered putting in Skull Raid, but were turned off by the 4 CMC of that card, Undercity Plunder might be worth the slot that you have Skull Raid in, or decided to, whatever you decided to play over Skull Raid, consider Undercity Plunder for that style of deck. If you are not running that style of deck, I personally don't think this is particularly worth it. Basically, if you're not running, if you would not consider running Turgid or Tiny Bones, then Undercity Plunder is probably not where you want to be. If you are running something like that, I think this card is legit. So you get a lot for only 2 mana. So I think this card is good in the right situation. All right, next up, we have Swarm Saboteur. This is a 2/1 for 2 with ninjutsu of 1 and a black. And when I say it's 1 and a black in the casting cost, human ninja with death touch. Whenever Swarm Saboteur deals combat damage to a player, conjure a card named Virus Beetle into your hand. Virus Beetle being a 1/1 for 2 that forces artifact creature, notably, that forces your opponent to discard a card. So Swarm Saboteur could actually fit in the same deck as the last card we were just looking at. I think it's interesting, except at the end of the day, this feels like an uncommon to me. I feel like being able to conjure up a card into your hand is not bad. I mean, it's drawing a card effectively. So drawing a card upon dealing damage to your opponent is not bad. But we've seen that effect. And we've seen that effect in cards like Ninja the Depowers as a nice little throwback, which also ninjutsu's in for 2, in blue, to be honest. But still, this feels expensive at rare. If this was an uncommon, I'd say, sure, if you're running ninjas, why not give it a shot? But at rare, I don't think this is particularly worth it, and I love ninjas. I think ninjutsu is a fantastic ability and super duper fun. Now, to be fair, one thing that this can do, the Swarm Saboteur, I keep wanting to say Swarm Shambler. One thing that Swarm Saboteur can do is provide multiple Virus Beetles. Now, Virus Beetle will always be a sorcery speed activation. However, it is a 1/1 body on the board that has a strong ETB effect, which synergizes nicely with ninjas. So this is part of an engine that if you can get it moving, you can create multiple Virus Beetles. If you can bounce Swarm Saboteur back to your hand in one way or another, being able to use the Virus Beetles to ninjutsu Swarm Saboteur back in, get more Virus Beetles. That's kind of a fun idea, but to be honest, that feels like more of a meme than a successful strategy. And if you're interested in trying to make janky memes happen, this card is for you. And as a result, this card is for me. But if you're interested in successful competitive strategies, I don't believe Swarm Saboteur is where you want to be. All right, next up, Soul Servitude. Soul Servitude is an instant for 2 and a black that says target player sacrifices a non-token creature. When they do, you may discard a card. Okay, if you do, conjure a duplicate of the sacrificed creature into your hand. It perpetually gains, you may spend mana as though or mana of any color to cast the spell. Wow, that is weird, and I like it. So it doesn't allow your opponent to sacrifice tokens, which is great, but it's not as targeted as a card like Soul Shatter. Whereas Soul Shatter gets the biggest creature that they have, Soul Servitude, it gives them an opportunity to choose what non-token creature they want to sacrifice. Kind of a bummer, but not the end of the world. You are getting a non-token creature. So if they have a million Scoot Swarm tokens, they can't just sacrifice one of their Scoot Swarm tokens to this thing and move on. Or if they have a bunch of the Wedding Announcement tokens, for example, and the only one creature like a Welcoming Vampire or something like that, they have to sacrifice the non-token creature. I think that's good design. I like it. And if that creature was good enough, you can replace a card in your hand for a copy of that creature. I think that's very interesting. I would consider this a sideboard card if you're going up against a creature light deck. If you're going up against an aggro deck that has a ton of creatures lying around, letting one, I don't know, Elite Spellbinder go, it's kind of a bummer for them, but if they have 15 power that they're going to turn sideways the next turn, they don't really care. And you just spent 3 mana on that. Bad feeling. This is also instant speed, which is relevant. I think that's actually quite good because you can do that upon attacks and really get them thinking about the way combat lines up. That's kind of interesting and fun. But in general, I think this is an interesting sideboard card if you're going up against a creature light deck, because if you're going up against like an Azorius control deck where the only creature in the whole freaking thing is Hullbreaker Horror, this just ices their Hullbreaker Horror and gives you one. Like, yes, I will gladly discard the swamp for a copy of Hullbreaker Horror that I can cast next turn. Yes, please. Oh, and that next turn is going to be mine because it was my end step or it was your end step in which I cast this. That could be devastating. So the fact that this is instant speed is very, very important. So if somebody flashes in Hullbreaker Horror, if they tap 7 to flash into Hullbreaker Horror, after it resolves, before the turn is over, you pay 3, cast Soul Servitude, their sucker dies, you discard something, boom, next turn you drop a Hullbreaker Horror, now they're on the defensive. Beautiful. I think that situation is awesome, but it's pretty situational. That is a very unique circumstance that you could find yourself in. Also, if you're going up against like Reanimator strategies that only have 2 or 3 creatures on board at any given time that are usually pretty darn big and scary, this could be valuable in those situations as well. But like I said, I think this is a good card coming out of the sideboard. I wouldn't want to main deck this. Also, notably, it says non-token creature. In Alchemy, there are plenty of cards like the Saboteur we were just looking at that conjures cards. Those cards, so those virus beetles that the Swarm Saboteur creates, are not tokens. They are considered actual cards that are created. So somebody in that situation running that style of deck, if they're going for that meme we were just talking about, they could sacrifice the virus beetles to satisfy Soul Servitude. That's not good. I don't like that. And so I think in Alchemy, this is uniquely positioned to not be as effective as it would be in a format like Standard, but that is what it is. But I think the card is an interesting design. I think it's a cool design, and if you're doing best of 3, and you want something that can break a control mirror, or something that can something that you can slot in and tech in against creature light decks, I think this could be very, very interesting. But against creature heavy decks, I don't think it's going to be. Even at instant speed, 3 mana is not where you want to be for a kill spell. It's just a little too expensive, especially one where you don't get to pick the target. So it's interesting. I like it, but I don't think it's particularly. It's not universally good, but a good sideboard card. All right, next up. Semblance Scanner. This is 2 and a blue for an equipment shapeshifter that is a 3/1. An equipment shapeshifter. That's interesting. Okay, so what does it have? Whenever Semblance Scanner or equipped creature deals combat damage to a player, if it's not a token, conjure a duplicate of it into your hand. I think this is very interesting. But I don't know that it's very good. A 3/1 for 3 is very pricey. It's just not a particularly good rate. But actually, the more I look at it, the more this reminds me of Trickster's Talisman. Trickster's Talisman is a card from Adventures in the Forgotten Realm. It is a 1-drop equipment that when the equipped creature deals combat damage to a player, you can sacrifice Trickster's Talisman to create a duplicate copy. I believe you sacrifice the Talisman. In any event, you can create a duplicate of the equipped creature. This, however, it only has a reconfigure cost of 1, which is not bad. So what I'm thinking is this as an equipment, a 3-drop equipment that can equip for 1, is this worth it? Now, this is a little bit worse than that because it can get picked off by creature-based removal spells in response to the reconfigure trigger. So that is something to keep in mind. Reconfigure creatures in a unique way are actually worse than equipment, in my opinion. Now, they're a little more useful because at the end of the day, this is just 3 power you can punch at your opponent, which isn't bad. I mean, you may need that. There are situations where you just need 3 power on the board to just smack, and I get that. But this gives you an ability to create token copies, or you create multiple cards, and you draw cards. Semblance Scanner, when you attack with it, you draw cards. Now, those cards are either a copy of Semblance Scanner if you just attacked with it directly, or whatever is equipped. Is that good? Well, depending on what you're copying, that could be really good. If you're copying Goldspan Dragons, that's fantastic. If you're copying, well, virus beetles, maybe not. Or maybe that could be great too in the right context. So I think this card is interesting. I think it's kind of a janky build-around card, but to be honest, it might be pretty fantastic. I'm not mad at it. Also, one of the things that I don't know is how this interacts with the sagas. And so the first thing that I think of is Fable of the Mirror Breaker. The reflection of Kiki Jiki is not a legendary creature. So if you conjured up a duplicate into your hand, what I don't know is the duplicate that you conjure a copy of both sides, or is it just a copy of the reflection? I think it would be both sides, so you should be able to play out the saga, but don't quote me on that. And in that situation, this could actually be really cool because you could reload a bunch of really useful sagas that give you all kinds of value. As long as those sagas flip into creatures, because those are non-token creatures, which is interesting. So that could be a cool use case, a cool situation. I think Semblance Scanner is interesting. Again, I don't think the power level of this card is quite where you want to be in a competitive environment, but I could be wrong. Fable of the Mirror Breaker provides a similar service in creating duplicate copies of stuff, except it creates token copies that stick on the board and that come into play for only 1 mana. I think the fact that you have to recast the spell makes Semblance Scanner significantly worse, but at the same time, in the right deck, in the right shelf, this could be very good. It makes sure you don't run out of gas. And that's nice. I like not running out of gas. I like having cards in my hand, and Semblance Scanner can give that to you. So this one kind of needs to be seen. So if I were you, and I was in a situation, well, if you are in a situation where you're debating on whether or not to craft this card, I would wait and see. I would wait a couple weeks and see if the competitive minds find a use for this card. Because if they do, great, craft it and get after it. But I'm not seeing it personally myself. I think this is a fun, janky build around. I'm going to try to do stuff with it, but I don't think it's competitive. But we'll see. I could be wrong on that. All right, next up, we have Runaway Growth, and this is the first card that we're looking at that leverages a new mechanic called Intensity. So Runaway Growth is an enchantment aura for 3 and a green, enchant land, starting Intensity 1. I'm sure you're wondering, Intensity? What the hell? Don't worry, we'll get there. Whenever enchanted land is tapped for mana, its controller adds an additional amount of green mana equal to Runaway Growth's intensity, then perpetually increase its intensity by 1. Now, intensity functions almost like a counter being placed on it. So imagine if this comes into play with 1 counter on it. When you use it, you get a second, and then you use it again, you get a third. And it taps for additional mana for every single counter on it, with a couple of exceptions. One thing about this, intensity is perpetual, meaning that if Runaway Growth were to be bounced or if the land were to get blown up and it goes to your graveyard, the intensity remains linked to that card. Whereas counters would fall off the moment it changes zones. But if Runaway Growth is bounced back to your hand by, say, a Geothermal Kami, or I don't know why you would do that, but if you did, you could, or a Divide by Zero, because Divide by Zero is still running around out there. If that's bounced back to if Runaway Growth is bounced back to your hand and you play it again, its intensity will remain whatever it was. This card I think is great. Frankly, if you're in a ramp situation, if you care about ramp, this card is good. 4 mana ramp is a sketchy situation. Also, you need to care about green mana. The fact that it only gives green mana and not mana of any color is a huge downside. So that's something that's very important to keep in mind. If you're in a ramp shell that can use a lot of green mana, either by filtering it through something or by using it to cast heavy green creatures and possibly casting multiples of them in a turn, this could be very, very good. If you aren't in that specific situation, ignore this card because it produces a lot of green mana, but you need something to spend that on. If you don't have, there's a couple of things. The intensity doesn't increase unless you use it. So if you don't use it, you lose it. But if you do use it, you get to ramp 1 additional. So it's almost like hitting an additional land drop every single turn, except that land drop is always going to be a forest. If that sounds great to you because you really love ramping in green, awesome. This is your card. If that doesn't sound like a good time to you, then it's probably not worth a second look. Because it's very one trick. It does that one thing, but it does it really well. Ramp at 4 mana is tricky. Now, it also is an enchantment. So if you care about enchantments, if you have, Enchantress synergies, if you're running Sithis and Historic, for example, or doing something like that something like that, Runaway Growth could be very, very worthwhile. I think this card is interesting. I like the idea of it in a green-based ramp shell. I think it's good. If you're not in a green-based ramp shell, definitely, then don't worry about it. That said, I don't know if it's as good as the other 4-drops that are available, or if you want to be ramping past 4 anyway. Now, notably, in a deck like this, if you get a Prosperous Innkeeper on 2, or a Reclusive Taxidermist on 2, or any other, if in older formats, Gilded Goose and those types of things, can get you to 4 mana as quickly as turn 3, pretty consistently. And maybe as early as turn 2 if you get the nuts with a Lotus Cobra or something. But all in all, I think it wouldn't be that hard to get this started quickly in the early game. Now that said, in the late game, it's awful. This, like, drawing this on turn 12 is about the worst draw you could possibly hit. Like, I mean, I would rather draw a basic land than draw Runaway Growth that late in the game, unless I have enchantment synergies, just because it just doesn't give you much. But all in all, interesting card. Green ramp, yay. If not, pass. All right, Molten Impact is our next card. It is 1 and a red for a sorcery that deals 4 damage to target creature or planeswalker. If excess damage was dealt this way, when you cast your next instant or sorcery spell, Molten Impact deals damage equal to the excess to target creature or planeswalker. I love this design. The fact that it can only hit creatures or planeswalkers is relevant. So what this does is it puts damage on layaway. So usually when you have to bolt something like a Lotus Cobra or a Prosperous Innkeeper that we previously mentioned, like when I have to spend a Demon Bolt, something that can deal 4 damage, or Thundering Rebuke, for example, to kill a 1 toughness creature, I feel awful. It's just, it feels like you're spending so much excess to deal with something so small. You know, hitting a 0/1 or a 1/1, or even in the case of Lotus Cobra, a 2/1 with 4 damage just feels bad, because that's 3 damage that's just effectively going to waste. It's just gone forever, unless Molten Impact's around. Because Molten Impact says, yeah, you deal the 1 damage, but that 3 damage that you have just chilling, that's available for later. Now, the moment you cast your next instant or sorcery spell, whatever that spell is, those 3 damage would trigger, and these would go to something that's out there on the board. Also, notably, this is not a May ability. If excess damage was dealt this way, when you cast your next instant or sorcery spell, Molten Impact deals damage equal to the excess to target creature or planeswalker. This could be really, 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 really bad if you are the only one with creatures or planeswalkers on the board, because you basically have to Flame Tongue Kavu one of your own things, which if it has a high toughness and say you took out a 2-drop with it and you're shocking a 3 toughness creature, you really don't care. But that is a big gotcha that I think a lot of people are going to get hit with. So be very, very careful of that. Which is to say, when this goes off, you better have a target for the excess damage. Otherwise, instants or sorceries are off the table for you. Unless there are no viable targets, in which case I believe the damage will just fade away into eternity. But in short, I think this is a good removal spell. Because it can only target creatures or planeswalkers, it is removal. It's not burn, per se. It can't go face. But I think this is a good spell, and the threat of activation is suddenly there. Because if you take out a small creature early, your opponent is like, oh, is that an op that they have in their hand that they're about to like lightning bolt one of my things with? Like, that could be a real scary situation for your opponent to be in, and they're going to have to seriously consider whether or not they want to play any other creatures on the board, as long as you have that excess mana banked like that. So I think Molten Impact is actually a really good card. I think this is a cool removal spell that I do think is going to see some play. So if you run red mid-range or red control and you're looking for removal, I think Molten Impact actually is pretty solid. And if you're in a burn situation where you have like some of the like Conductive Current, I think is one of a card that's in Alchemy right now. If you're running those kinds of effects, I think Molten Impact could slot right in there and actually be really cool. In the case of the Current, actually, it buffs a burn spell in your hand by giving it an additional 2 damage, if I'm not mistaken. That on a Molten Impact could be fantastic, because that all of a sudden, Molten Impact could deal 6 damage to a 1-drop and leave 5 in reserve, or, you know, something of that nature. So, pretty cool. I think this card is great. Actually, I think this card is legitimately good. 4 damage for 2 mana is usually worth the price of admission anyway, and the fact that you get excess mana stored up for a later turn, awesome. Absolutely awesome. And if that follow-up spell is a burn, that's just great. So it just adds more. So this could straight up turn your shock into a 1 mana 4 damage, or 1 mana lightning bolt, you know, just 1 for 1. That's awesome. Add Toral's Disciple in the mix. You could literally be casting lightning bolt for like 5 damage with this thing. I love it. I think Molten Impact is great. Yeah, this card slaps. If you're running red, consider it. All right, next up, Kami of Transmutation. 2/2 for 2, 1 and a white. Creature spirit. When Kami of Transmutation enters or leaves the battlefield, choose 1. Now, leaves the battlefield, not death trigger. Note that. If it's exiled or bounced, you still get it. Each permanent card in your hand perpetually becomes an artifact in addition to its other types, or each permanent card in your hand perpetually becomes an enchantment in addition to its other types. This card is weird. You didn't need me to tell you that. You already looked at it and were like, what is this? And to be honest, I'm right there with you. I don't know. I don't know the right shell for this card because it only impacts the cards in your hand. It doesn't impact the cards in your library. So anything you draw after this triggers, it is what it is. Cards like All That Glitters and Historic are very, very powerful, and cards like, All That Glitters, Machiko's Reign of Truth, those kinds of things that give +1/+1 for each artifact or enchantment are good. And so being able to turn non-artifacts or non-enchantments into artifacts or enchantments could be quite strong. In a situation where you're running like Affinity, for example, and you want to have a bunch of artifacts, turning all your Affinity payoffs that aren't artifacts into artifacts could be great. But is that really worth it? Because that's asking a couple of things of your situation. You have to have those cards in your hand, for starters, and they need to hit the board. They need to be in your hand when Kamigawa Transmutation enters the battlefield and or leaves the battlefield. Okay, like in a situation where you can sacrifice the Kamigawa Transmutation at a whim to time when you kind of type shift your hand, could be valuable, I suppose. I say type shift. That's not exactly accurate. You're adding types to the cards. You're not changing them. I think there is a combo with this card that is going to be broken in half and may require it to be rebalanced. Or it will do nothing. That's where we're at with this card. I think this card is either absolutely nothing or completely and totally busted, and I just don't see the combo yet. But it's one of those two. So this is a wait and see for me. I don't think you should craft this right away until somebody, maybe myself, subscribe to the YouTube channel if you want to see Alchemy deck techs and possibly something with this card. If we're able to crack it, then maybe it's worth a craft. But all in all, I think this is probably a pass. It's a cool idea. It's a cool design space, but that doesn't equal worth my wild cards. And for that, I would say probably pass on this one unless you have a very specific reason not to. Next up, Kami of Mourning. So we have more Kami in the mix. This is a 3/2 spirit for 2 and a black. Whenever Kami of Mourning enters the battlefield, target creature you control or creature card in your graveyard perpetually gains. Whenever a creature you control with greater mana value than this card dies, return this card from your graveyard to the battlefield tapped. That is a mountain of text to basically say one card can perpetually reanimate itself when bigger cards die. I love making weird graveyard loops. It's kind of my favorite thing. My commander deck of choice right now is all about getting Animate Dead on a Sun Titan to reanimate stuff over and over again. I cannot get enough of cards like this. However, I find myself looking at this one and thinking, holy cow, these are some hoops to jump through. Here's the best case scenario with the Kami of Mourning. You hit a 2-drop. Your 2-drop, or you have a 2-drop in the graveyard or a 2-drop is on the field. You play Kami of Mourning for 3. Let's say you have a virus, let's just use Virus Beetle because it's kind of a running theme throughout the course of this set review. So we have a Virus Beetle on the board. We play Kami of Mourning, give our Virus Beetle this ability, right? We then sacrifice the Virus Beetle to something. Cool. We then sacrifice, like a Dockside Chef or a Deadly Dispute. We then sacrifice the Kami of Mourning to something, or Kami of Mourning dies in combat. Virus Beetle comes back, we get the ETB trigger again. Dope. We then sacrifice the Virus Beetle again. Okay, cool. Then we do some other shenanigans. Another creature dies, the Virus Beetle comes back, they discard a card again. Like, that's kind of the best case scenario. And in that case, it's not bad, but it's not amazing. The other thing that we can do is we could put, say, like, we could use Assemble from Parts to get Kami of Mourning back and do some other weird loops with that. Like, I feel like there's something here, and I'm going to experiment with it. This card has my name written all over it. If there is a single card from this expansion that I'm looking forward to crafting and getting to play with, it's this one. But I don't know if I can recommend that you do the same, because there are a couple of things that we're missing in Alchemy right now. In Alchemy, we don't have a great sacrifice outlet, and a lot of the creatures that we want to be recurring are like 3 and 4 drops. Like City Stalker Connoisseur, for example, it's a 4-drop. We want to get that ETB a lot, but in order to take advantage of that enter the battlefield trigger, we need to have creatures that are 5 and up dying regularly, and that's not an easy task to take advantage of. So Kami of Mourning is not a good way to loop those, whereas Kami of Mourning itself can trigger creatures that are 1s or 2s, or even 0s in the case of cards like Ornithopter, if you ever wanted to recur that for any reason. that can get that looping, which could be interesting. And if we have ways to take advantage of those enter the battlefield triggers, then okay, or cards that trigger on entering the battlefield or creatures dying, like Bastion of Remembrance, Meathook Massacre, those kinds of things. All of a sudden, being able to loop Blood Artists and those types of things to sack out lists could actually be very, very powerful. So I think this has an opportunity to possibly be a player in Historic. I don't know if it has what it takes to shine in Alchemy in the current meta. But maybe there is something that's waiting to be seen. So I think Combi Mourning is interesting. If you are interested in graveyard loops and reanimator shenanigans, I think this is worth a try. If that's not generally your bag, it's a wait and see. All right, next up, we have Junkyard Scrapper. Junkyard Scrapper is a 3/3 Goblin Artificer for 2 and a red. Whenever a non-token artifact enters the battlefield under your control, exile a random non-land artifact card with lesser mana value from your library. You may cast that card until the end of your next turn. Okay, so we have a couple things going on here. We have a non-token artifact entering the battlefield, and then you exile a random non-land artifact card with lesser mana value from your library. So you impulsively draw a random card from your library with mana value less than the artifact you just played. Okay, it is the end of your next turn, not the end of this turn. That's good. I can appreciate that. This also is going to trigger every single time you play a non-token artifact. The first thing that comes to my mind when I see a card like this is Affinity. If you're in a situation where you are running Affinity creatures like Thought Monitor, then all of a sudden this is great because Thought Monitor has a CMC of what, 7? So that's going to exile, like, so that could draw you a phenomenal number of cards, and you then get to play it out. Also, interestingly enough, when you cast the card, it is a non-token artifact entering the battlefield under your control. So Junkyard Scrapper can create a loop that way, which is pretty darn cool. And in an Affinity situation, you can hit a 7-drop as early as turn 4 with this thing, and then draw into your 5s or 6-drops, which may or may not have Affinity themselves, which could be really, really powerful. So I think Junkyard Scrapper is interesting. This also could go really nicely with the, what is it, Aerial Mechanaut, the 2/2 from Kamigawa that makes all your artifact spells cost 1 less. So that's another situation that can make the draws off this easier to hit. And so I think this Junkyard Scrapper is actually a card draw engine in an archetype that has seen some mainstream acceptance and some play in Alchemy right now, but not a ton. It's not a particularly, Affinity is not a particularly popular deck, or at least, no, sorry, not Alchemy, Historic. It sees some play in Historic, but I don't know that this has what it takes to handle Alchemy per se. Although, come to think of it, this could also be useful in decks that run like Oni Cult Anvil, and those kind of Rakdos artifact sacrifice lists. That could also take advantage of this, because every time you drop a 2-drop artifact, or every time you drop a 1-drop artifact, you're guaranteed to, or every time you drop a 2 or 3-drop artifact, you're guaranteed to hit something like an Experimental Synthesizer, which is going to draw you additional cards. So that could be fantastic. Or an Iron Apprentice, or something, a 1-drop that can get you additional value and just kind of tack it on and make sure you have something to spend your mana on, because those decks can run out of gas. And so Junkyard Scrapper is a way of continuing to not refill the hand per se, because you're refilling the exile zone that can then go to the battlefield. But I think it's interesting. I think Junkyard Scrapper actually could be a real player in a deck like that. If you care about artifacts, if you're running a lot of artifacts, whether that's in a sacrifice deck, whether that's in an Affinity situation, this card is probably worth a look. I would definitely give it a shot. It's also a notable creature type in Goblin, but I don't think it would fit in a Goblin's deck specifically, because it's just a 3/3 for 3 in that context, which isn't quite where you want to be. But yeah, if you can take advantage of the artifact synergies, go for it. I think this like, it could actually be quite strong. Yeah, so definitely worth a look. All right, next up we have Juke Out Liberator. This is 2 into green for a 3/3 Snake Ninja. Love me those ninjas, especially in green. I gotta say, Neon Dynasty had a lot of great green ninjas. Anyway, whenever Juke Out Liberator deals combat damage to a player, choose land or non-land. Seek a permanent card of the chosen type. Awesome. I think this is great. So you draw a card. You draw a card and you get to pick whether it's a land or not a land. Great. Like, that's absolutely fantastic. And like, what more do you want? For a 3/3 that can ninja in for 2? Like, I don't know what else to say about this card. I think it's great. It's an adventurous impulse on a ninja. It's a Saboteur effect, so that it's whenever you deal damage to the enemy player, So you get the ninjutsu where you get to sneak it in once as early as turn 2, potentially, to deal 3 damage to their face and then seek up a card. Awesome. And if you need to hit your land drops, that guarantees you're going to hit your next land drop. If you don't need to hit your land drops, it's going to add just a little bit of fuel to your hand. Awesome. And then it's a 3/3 on the board, and if you're able to deliver another hit with it, you get to do it all over again. I think this card slaps. Like, if you're in a green situation that wants to be aggressive in any way, if you have, especially if you're in a situation where you have 1-drops lying around, especially like Death Touch 1/1s, like if you're running Fang of Shigeki in any situation, I'd probably consider taking a look at Juke Out Liberator. Notably, unlike a lot of the snakes that we saw in Kamigawa Neon Dynasty, this snake ninja is not an enchantment. That is important to keep in mind. There are a lot of great enchantment creatures like Fang of Shigeki out there that are snakes, or Shigeki himself, that are snakes and enchantments. This is not one of them. So if you're running enchantment synergies, which is the other situation I can see Fang of Shigeki, maybe Juke Out Liberator doesn't fit, but it's still a decent card draw engine on a relevant body. And even if you end up casting out for 3, I'm not mad at that. I think the card's actually quite strong. So yeah, I think Juke Out Liberator is legit. All right, next up, we have Inchblade Companion, which is a very awkward name, if I may say. But it is a 1/1 equipment insect for 1 white, that is. Equipped creature gets +1/+1. Okay, I'm listening. Whenever Inchblade Companion becomes attached to a creature, which is not a situation where we usually see triggers, create a token that's a copy of Inchblade Companion, except it doesn't have this ability. This ability triggers only once each turn. So, and it reconfigures for 2. It becomes attached for 2. So you get a free 1/1 just by equipping a +1/+1 buff to something else. That's kind of cool. I'm not mad at that. And then you can reconfigure that other one onto something else to give it an additional +1/+1. So that's nice. The fact that it reconfigures for 2 is a meaningful cost, so you can't just have these things flying around all over the place. But the fact that it can create a lot of different copies of itself means that this could get out of hand pretty quickly if left unchecked. This actually kind of reminds me of Scoot Swarm, except it's a little less powerful because the copies don't make copies. So only the OG will make a copy. So if the original Inchblade Companion gets destroyed, you like, any copies that you have are all you're left with. That's it. But at the same time, you can create a lot of little 1/1s that are insects, if that's relevant. If you're running like Blex, for example, then maybe that is. Although, why would you be running Blex and white? I don't know, maybe because of this card. I'm intrigued. We'll see. But I don't know. I think it's interesting. It's an interesting use of an event that usually doesn't trigger an ability, triggering an ability. So that's a cool new take. I think it's fine. I think the card is interesting. It's not amazing. I don't love it. I feel like if this was an uncommon, I'd say heck yes, craft it and run it. At a rare, I don't know. I'm not loving it, but I'm intrigued by it. So if I happen to, like, I will probably buy some alchemy packs. If I happen to crack them, cool. I will give it a try. If I don't, I'm not losing any sleep over it. It's one of those. But anyway, so it's an interesting card. I'd say wait and see on it. I wouldn't craft this one early. All right, next up, we have Imperial Blademaster. This is a 2/2 human samurai for 1 red, white with double strike. We've got double strike on a creature. 2/2 for 3. I'm interested. Whenever a samurai or warrior you control attacks alone, draft a card from Imperial Blademaster's spellbook. Let's take a look at the spell book. So we have Adamant Will, Aki Ronin, Ancestral Katana, Eater of Virtue, Asari Captain, Ganjo Exemplar, a Ganjo Uprising. Sorry, I know this looks awful on the camera, but Reinforced Ronin. It's a bunch of samurai payoffs from Kamigawa Neon Dynasty. Interesting. That's actually very interesting. The samurai deck is one that hasn't quite come together, and trust me, I've tried. I've tried a myriad of different variants. The one that I thought had the best potential that never quite got there was actually using a Ganjo Uprising. So the fact that that card is in this spellbook, I find very intriguing. So I think that's interesting. But really the money for this card, where it's really shining for me and what really sings, in my opinion, is that double strike. A 2/2 for 3 with double strike is worth the price of admission. It just is. It hits for 4 damage. 2 of which is first strike damage. It's really difficult to block in combat. It's tough to deal with. And this has the upside of potentially drawing you some cards that may or may not be relevant in your particular deck. You know, this is one of those things, if you can get an Eater of Virtue on this thing and make it a 4/2 double striker, dope. That's just bonus. But at the same time, if that doesn't happen, you still have a body your opponent has to worry about. And that's great. And if you only have that one body that your opponent has to worry about, Well, it's going to draw you cards every time it attacks. So Imperial Blademaster, I think, is decent. I think this card is actually pretty good. If you're running Boros aggro, I'd say run it. Like, it doesn't hurt. Like, this does not have to be a dedicated samurai deck in order for Imperial Blademaster to be good. Also, if you get something like the Blademaster that gives all samurai +1/+0 for each other samurai you control, if it attacks alone, then all of a sudden it's going to buff the Imperial Blademaster. So the cards in this spellbook support this card. That's really important. Even if you don't run other samurai, which if you do, it's only going to help. But if you don't run other samurai, Imperial Blademaster is still worth the price of admission on its own. I think this card is actually quite strong in aggro lists. If you're running Boros aggro, check it out. I think this is worth it. All right, next up, we got Holographic Double. This is a 1/1 illusion for 1 blue with the ability, 1 blue, exile Holographic Double from your hand. Choose a creature card in your hand, conjure a duplicate of it into your hand. I think this card is weird. I don't know what else to say. It basically acts as 4 additional copies of whatever your best creature is in the deck, but you have to play 1 blue to take advantage of them. You can do a lot worse than that. You can do a lot worse than that. This is a card that's frankly feels a little unfair, because for a mild cost, it gets around a major deck building requirement, or major deck building restriction, in that you can only have 4 cards, 4 creatures of any name in your deck. Yeah, like, that restriction kind of goes out the window the moment you have Holographic Double, because you can have, now you have 4 Holographic Doubles in addition to 4 of your Goldspan Dragons, or 4 of your Hullbreaker Horrors, or, I mean, the only problem with that is, if you draw a Holographic Double but you don't have the other card in your hand, this is just a 1/1 for 1. It's actually quite awful. So I guess the more I look at it, the more I realize it's not as busted as I had previously thought. But at the same time, it could be good. To be honest, I have a feeling the vast majority of, I think the vast majority of people who are considering running this will find it to be ineffective. The more I look at it, the less I like it, is where I'm at with this one. So I don't think Holographic Double has what it takes. It looks incredibly unfair at first blush, but upon a second inspection, it's because you have to have the other card in your hand already. You don't have the advantage of being able to draw an 8th copy or a 5th copy of a particular creature. So the only situation I can find myself using this is in some kind of aggro deck where I have a lot of creatures anyway, and I just want to be able to take advantage and create a copy of like a Lord or something like that. But where the fail case is, I get an additional copy of a good 3-drop or something like that. However, I can't think of an archetype like that in blue. Or I can't think of a good style of deck that's viable in the meta right now in blue. Like, Blue-White Flyers comes to mind as a possibility for, if, you know, maybe if that becomes viable in some other situation. But all in all, I don't think Holographic Double's got what it takes. I would pass on this one. Yeah, it's an interesting design. I like the idea, but I don't like it in execution. I don't think it's going to work. All right, next up, we have Futurist Spell Thief. This is 2 into blue for a 3/2 flash Moonfolk Wizard. All right, I like Moonfolk. I like wizards. Wizards are cool. Let's see what it does. When Futurist Spell Thief enters the battlefield, conjure a duplicate of target spell into your hand. That card perpetually gains. You may spend mana as though or mana of any color to cast that spell. Now, I'm sure what you're probably thinking is, wait a minute, is the spell coming from play? Is it coming from your hand? No, it's not. It's coming from the stack. And the reason that I know that is because it says target spell, not target instant or sorcery, or target card. It's saying spell. The only time that a spell is a spell is when it's on the stack. So what Futurist Spell Thief does is when your opponent plays out a card, so it plays out a creature or an enchantment or whatever, they play out a spell, because all cards that you tap for mana and put out are spells. You create a copy of it. So for 3 mana, you don't counter their spell, you literally steal it. It's a spell thief. Now, interestingly enough, if you do throw this future spell thief, you can steal it, and while it's still on the stack, you can still counter it with another spell if you want, which is kind of fun. Also, notably, if you use Futurist Spell Thief on a counter spell that is countering one of your other spells, or if you're in a stack battle where you have multiple spells live on the stack, Futurist Spell Thief can grab grab the most powerful counterspell and whip it back at itself, you know, the original counterspell that is trying to counter your thing, and counter it, allowing your initial spell to resolve. I know this is complicated, but it's a weird interaction that would let you counter something. You would let you counter a counter spell with it. And if you're not in a situation where you care about countering a counter spell, and your opponent just plays a good creature, for example, you can say, you know what, I like that. Next turn, I'd like one too. And you get a 3/2 body on board at the same time, which is pretty fantastic. Also, with combat tricks, this could be really relevant, because if you're in a blocking situation, your opponent plays like a Snakeskin Veil or an Inscription of Abundance on their creature to buff it up and make it stronger, you can throw the Future Spell Thief, take a copy of that, and if you have the mana for it, you can then buff your creature that's blocking it with the exact same spell. So that's kind of an interesting... this can create interesting situations, and it will reward creative play. I like that. I think that's really cool. So if you are playing in a unique, weird, if you want to play on another level, if you want to play on the stack, if you want to experiment and see what you can do with 3 mana, this could be a really interesting card. I like it. And it gives you a 3/2 body with flash for 3. That's a relevant creature type. So even if you don't have, to be honest, in a tempo situation, this card is great, because even in a situation where you don't have a spell you can copy, just sticking a 3/2 that your opponent doesn't see coming could be the difference between getting in for an early 9 damage or not. And that could be huge. That could be a huge tempo advantage that can win you the game. So I think Future Spell Thief is actually really cool. I think in tempo situations, in control situations, or in mid-range decks where you want to get saucy, I think this card is actually pretty darn fantastic. I like Future Spell Thief. This is a neat design. All right, next up, we have Fragment Reality. I am shocked that a card named Fragment Reality didn't exist before, but here we are. This is an instant for 1 white. Exile target non-token artifact, creature, or enchantment. Its controller puts a random creature card with lesser mana value from their library onto the battlefield tapped. One more time. Okay, I'm doing this in one consistent take. And I haven't seen all of these cards before, so a lot of these are first impressions. So exile target non-token, so it is restricted in that regard. So you can't touch treasure, you can't touch creature tokens, relevant. Creature or enchantment, okay, its controller puts a random creature card with lesser mana value from their library on the battlefield tap. So they are guaranteed to get something. This reminds me very much of Divine Gambit, which is a card that costs 2, but they got to just drop a permanent from their hand into play. So with Fragment Reality, you get to hit a big threat on the board that is either an artifact, creature, or an enchantment, and they get something with lesser mana value. So you can hit a 7-drop, they can get a 1-drop, which is pretty rad. This is also exile. So if you're in Historic, you could exile somebody's Ulamog. Now, there's a chance that they will spin into their Nezahal and make you sad all the same. Or there's a chance that they will spin into... I don't know, a Moonstare, like a Moonsnare prototype, and you're not going to give any craps. So, I mean, Fragment Reality is a very interesting card. It's, I think it's cool. I think it downgrades one of your opponent's things. It downgrades a threat from your opponent. Now, it's not true removal, because they get something out of the deal. It reminds me a lot of Raven Form from Kaldheim that could exile an artifact or a creature, and they gave them a 1/1 Raven. It's kind of like that, except... they get something from their own deck, so it may have a synergy with their other game plan, which could be relevant. So this is going to be removal that's especially good in situations where your opponent's ramping, if they're doing Aetherflux Reservoir shenanigans, if they're cheating big stuff into play, being able to nuke those and possibly getting lower threats, or possibly getting non-threats onto the field could be very, very good. I can appreciate that. I'm thinking about actually Reanimator decks that I'm running right now. If somebody were to hit my Toxrill, for example, there's a chance that I'd spin into a Burning Rune Demon. You know? Is that really better for them? Maybe, depending on their board state. But at the end of the day, I'm kind of 6 of one, half a dozen of the other. That's fine. You want to spend 1 mana to give me a different huge threat that I'm going to beat you to death with? All right. But there's also a chance I'm going to hit a Restoration of a Ganjo with that. And it's like, well, that actually is a huge downgrade, and that really sucks. So things like that could happen. I think this card is interesting. I would pull it from the sideboard in a lot of situations. There's also a possibility, if you're going up against controlled decks or decks that are very permanent light, that you might actually be able to hit like a 2 or 3 drop with this, and they get nothing. That's not impossible. In decks that have a lot of spells at the low end and don't have creatures at those slots or artifacts or enchantments, that's not impossible. Not likely, but not impossible. So I think Fragment Reality is actually a decent sideboard card, but to be honest, I would probably still pass on it because it's not hard removal. I think this is the closest we're going to see to hard removal at 1. But Path to Exile or Swords to Plowshares, this is not, I'm afraid. I don't know. It's interesting. I'm very interested to see how people use it, but yeah, it's fine. It's fine. I probably would still run Fateful Absence over this, if that gives you an indicator. Anyway, next up, we have Foundry Beetle. This is 1 and a red for a 2/2 first strike equipment insect. And the equipped creature has first strike, rad. At the beginning of your upkeep, a random artifact card in your hand perpetually gains. The spell costs 1 less to cast. So, okay, it's a 2/2 first striker for 2. That's not bad. I like that. However, making an artifact card in your hand perpetually gain 1 less to cast, but only if the Foundry Beetle is equipped to something, and it's a random artifact. So I don't think Foundry Beetle is particularly strong. The perpetual cost reduction is something that Wizards, I think they learned their lesson on after Fearsome Whelp, because that card is busted in half, or at least it was busted in half when they initially printed it, to the point where they had to nerf it. And I think the nerf was correct. I think that was really a good call, because giving all dragons in your hand 1 cost reduction at the end of every turn was way too strong. Foundry Beetle, it gives a random artifact, not all artifacts, but a random artifact in your hand, a cost reduction of 1. Now, if you hit a 1-drop artifact with this, you get no benefit, which kind of sucks. Unless it's 1 generic, like an Iron Apprentice would go down to 0, which is not bad. That's not the end of the world, but it's not amazing. And to be honest, I think I would only run this if the first strike is relevant. A 2/2 first striker for 2 is a good creature in combat. That's good. I like that. And it can reconfigure for 1 and equip a creature to give it first strike. If you care about that, I think it's good. And to be honest, I think first strike is a highly underrated combat mechanic. I think it's very, very strong and underutilized and underappreciated. So I would definitely consider it for that purpose. So in an aggressive deck that is capable of putting 3 power, 4 power, 5 power bodies on board, I would consider Foundry Beetle just for the first strike. The artifact cost reduction ability, it may be relevant in certain matchups. It might be decent, but I'm not gonna stress over it, and I'm not gonna give it too much thought, to be honest. I think this is if the first strike's good, the card is good. If the first strike's not good for you in your deck, the card's not good, in my opinion. All right, next up, Chronicler of Worship. It is a 1 green 1/1 human monk. When Chronicler of Worship enters the battlefield, put a random shrine card from among the top 7 cards of your library into your hand. It perpetually gains. This spell costs 1 less to cast, then shuffle. And you can tap to add 1 mana of any color. This is about the narrowest card we've seen yet. This card is only going to be good in Shrines, because a 1/1 for 2 that can tap for a mana of any color, well, that's not bad, but Reclusive Taxidermist is strictly better if you don't care about Shrines. But if you do care about Shrines, all of a sudden, being able to just draw a Shrine and make it cost 1 less, that slaps. That's incredibly strong. But in order for you to have a shrine in the top 7 cards of your library, you need to have a critical mass of shrines in your deck. If you're not running 20 shrines, don't even consider this. But if you're running a 5-color shrine deck, especially in Historic where you have access to the Hondens and the Sanctums, if the whole goal is shrines all day, this card's amazing. Like, if you love shrines, love this card. It's going to do great things for you. It's a 1/1 for 2. It ramps you, it makes your shrines cost less, so all of a sudden those Hondens that are very expensive, like the Honden of Cleansing Fire, the white one, if I'm not mistaken, the thing costs 5 or maybe 4. In any event, it's very expensive for what you get, because at the beginning of your upkeep you gain you gain 2 life for every shrine you control, I believe it is. So the effect is just not quite great for how much you have to spend on it. But if you have Chronicler of Worship down, all of a sudden you drop it, the Honden comes into your hand, it now costs 1 less, and you have 1 more mana on board. All of a sudden, you're hitting that on turn 3 pretty consistently. That's great. So all of a sudden, those Hondens that are very expensive, or the Sanctums that are really expensive, open up to you in a cool way very early in the game if you hit this on turn 2. I think Chronicler of Worship in a Shrine deck is awesome. If you are running Shrines, if you love Shrines, if you are in the camp of, if you have the I Heart Shrines t-shirt, you want this card in your deck, and just craft it tomorrow, the moment it comes out. Just do it. If you are not running shrines, if you do not have a shrine deck, if you have no intention of building a shrine deck, if you do not, nor have you ever considered purchasing the I Heart Shrines t-shirt, just pass on this one. It's just not worth it. It's just so narrow. But it does what it does very well. To be honest, I think this should be an uncommon. Like, frankly, this isn't worth a rare wild card, but for unless you're, again, like hardcore shrines, I think this should, I personally would have preferred to see this on uncommon, but here we are. All right, next up, we have Boseiju Pathlighter. This is a 3/2 for 2 and a green. Human Rogue. When Boseiju Pathlighter enters the battlefield, draft a card from Boseiju Pathfinder's spellbook. We're going to go into spellbook mode. Let's take a look at this thing. So we have Bonder's Enclave, Boseiju Who Endures in the spellbook. Love that. Emergence Zone, Gingerbread Cabin, Field of Ruin, Hall of Oracles, Memorial to Unity, Colony Garden. This is just a ton of Thriving Grove, Treasure Vault, Secluded Courtyard, utility lands. It's all utility lands. The biggest one being Boseiju Who Endures. This card is amazing. If you can draft this, do it every time. If you see this on the spellbook, just grab it. But the Pathlighter itself, 3/2 for 3. When it enters the battlefield, you basically draw a land that may or may not be relevant. That's not bad. And in the case of cards like Bonder's Enclave or Boseiju, they are much more than a land, because they're lands that can draw you cards, or lands that can act as removal. Gingerbread Cabin gives you food tokens. Like, there's all kinds of stuff that you get out of that. So this actually could be pretty decent. The fact that it's a human, which is a relevant creature type. So in a Selesnya humans list, the fact that it is a 3-power human on 3 that draws you a land could be very, very, conjures you a land, no less. So you're not pulling it out of your deck. That's interesting. I like this. So in a situation where you're running a lot of 4 and 5 drops, if you're trying to go like heavy mana with things like Catilda, where you can pay 6 and just buff your whole team, like, I think this is interesting. In a ramp situation, this isn't bad. In a situation where you're running humans, I think this is legit. I don't hate it. I don't hate this card at all. I don't know that I love it, just because those aren't necessarily my styles. But in a situation where you're ramping, great. It drafts you draw cards just by it entering the battlefield, so that's legit. It does add a shock, which kind of sucks, but you've gotten the card out of it, so I think it's probably fine. I think that when it comes to the spellbook cards, the variance is very, very high on them. If you, in the case of something like Key to the Archive, all the spells in it, well, most of the spells in it are absolute bangers, and so you don't mind getting some of those. Whereas with Boseiju Pathlighter, if your choices are like Gingerbread Cabin, Hall of the Oracles, or I don't know, anyway. If they're bad, you're not going to feel good about grabbing any of them. But if it's like Boseiju Who Endures, Bonder's Enclave, and like one other real banger, then all of a sudden you're pretty happy. Like, you're going to be just fine. So it's interesting. The other cool thing about this is if you have this in your hand, you can safely keep like a 2 or 3 lander and be okay, because this is going to draw you a land. It's guaranteed to draw you a land, which is good. That's actually really cool. So I like the design. I think it's neat. This is another one of those that I don't think is worth a rare wild card, but would definitely be worth an uncommon, but that's irrelevant. But this is one of those that, like, yeah, if you're running humans, it might be worth it. If you're running humans and you are not happy with your 3-drop slot right now, definitely give this a look. If those situations don't apply to you, or if maybe in a ramp deck, it might be worthwhile too, because you just need to hit your land drops. If you just need to hit your land drops, maybe this is worth it. If you don't just need to hit your land drops, probably pass. All right. Next up, we have Better Offer. This is X and a blue. Put a random creature card with mana value X or less from target opponent's library onto the battlefield under your control. It perpetually has base power and toughness XX and perpetually gains ward 1. This is a card that I've seen this one before. This is one I've heard spoiled. I like the idea of it. And the fact that the creature that you steal from your opponent, and okay, a couple of things. This is putting the card under your control. So you are stealing it out of their deck. They do lose it, which is cool. They cannot draw that card that you steal, which I appreciate that. So this is similar to a card called Bribery. Bribery is a card that costs 3 blue, and it says, look at target opponent's library, choose a creature card from their library, and put it into play under your control. In Commander, that card is a house, because it's just like, look at your opponents, look at the person playing the ramp deck or the you know, the ramp deck or the reanimator deck, and they're like, you give me your library and I'm going to take your Emrakul or whatever and just put it into play under my control. Awesome. Absolutely fantastic. You can't, like, it doesn't get better than that. Better offer, however, you're stealing the creature and it's limited by X or less. So if they don't, so with bribery, you pay 5 and you're guaranteed to hit a creature unless your opponent has 0 creatures in their deck. 0. That's how much it would take. With better offer, you can hit this for 4, or if let's just say you put 5 into it. Let's say you spent 5 mana on this, X equals 4. And it turns out they don't have a single creature with mana value 4 or less. But they do have Hullbreaker Horror, and they do have Goldspan Dragon, and they do have some of these bigger, tougher creatures. You just don't get anything. That sucks. That's a horrible, feels bad. Chances of that happening, not great. But if you're in a situation where you're going up against an aggro player and they have a lot of 2 or 3 drops, you put 4 in, not only do you steal one of their 2 or 3 drops, or even a 1 drop, which is all fine and dandy, but in that situation, it enters the battlefield under your control as a 4/4 with Ward 1. So whatever other abilities it has, it's a 4/4. So if you put in 4 mana, steal their elite spellbinder, it enters the battlefield as a 4/4 flyer. You then get to use the enter the battlefield trigger and tack something out of their hand. And you have a 4/4 flyer with Ward 1. That's awesome. So the high end of this card is great. The fail case on this card is awful. And it's just... This is a high variance, high risk, high reward card. If that sounds intriguing to you, if you like rolling the dice, then I say go for it. But, you know, the other thing is of note, in a deck, if your opponent is running a lot of sagas that flip into creatures or a lot of token generators, they may have a deck that is capable of producing a lot of creatures with no creature cards for you to steal. That would be another real feels bad moment. So that's something to keep in mind as well. So... I don't know. I like the idea of this card way more than the reality of this card. And I could be proven wrong on it. I think the upside of this thing is so high, especially if you have an obscene amount of mana to sink into it. Because if you, like in a ramp situation, if you dump 9 mana into this, I don't care what the base creature is I'm stealing from you. It's a 9/9 Ward 1 for 10. And possibly with some other upside, possibly with some keywords, possibly with an ETB or a death trigger that I might be able to take advantage of. Great. Like, that's just money. So in ramp situations, like in a Simic ramp shell, 1 or 2 of these could be really fun, which is saying something. But I don't think this is a 4 of in any deck. I can't imagine running 4 of these in any deck. This could also be a good sideboard card as well, because if you're in a situation where your opponent has good ETB triggers, like a mono white aggro list, for example, that have enter the battlefield removal creatures like Brutal Cathar or Skyclave Apparition, being able to better offer on 4, steal your opponent's Skyclave Apparition and get something of theirs off the board. That is just lovely. So I like it. I like the idea of this card. So I'm going to give it a try. If a high risk, high reward card sounds like fun to you, give it a shot as well. If that doesn't sound like fun, wait and see. There might be a great matchup for this, but it's really dependent on the matchup. All right, next up, we have Bellows Breath Ogre. This is a 3/3 for 2 and a red with starting intensity 1. We talked about it like an hour ago, and we're back. Intensity's back, baby. I say that as though it's not brand new. Anyway, whenever Bellows Breath Ogre attacks, it deals damage equal to its intensity to any target, then perpetually increases its intensity by 1. Couple of things. So this is a 3/3 for 3 that when it attacks, you get to nuke something for 1. Or ping something for 1, I should say. It's not really a nuke, but you get to ping something for 1. Great. That's just good value. Now, and then the intensity ticks up. So next turn, you get to shock something. Turn after that, you get to bolt something. Turn after that, you get to demon bolt something. This is great. Now, that's if this thing is able to stick on the board and attack all those times, which is asking a lot, to be fair. But it's not impossible. And this is a cool way to snowball out of control. So it gives your opponent something that they need to worry about immediately. So this looks like a decent card in aggro strategies with red. The fact that it does not have haste is relevant, so I would definitely want to use, if I'm in Historic, I'd want to use like Goblin Ringleader to perpetually give this haste. That would be dynamite. Or I'd want to have a card like Rabbit Battery on board that can give this thing haste regularly. Or Reckless Stormseeker, those kinds of things that can grant haste. I think that's very, very important for this card because it's going to die. But notably, when it dies, it retains its intensity. So if you get an opportunity to attack with this on this once, its intensity ticks up to 2. It dies, okay, fine. You bring it back by reanimating it or pulling it back to your hand somehow, or you manage to protect it, whatever. If it comes back, or they bounce it, for example, and you play it out again, then it has intensity 2. Like, it has that, and then that progresses and continues. So I can see this being valuable in a couple of scenarios. The one that strikes me the most is like an is it tempo shell, where I want to stick this on turn 3 and then counter everything you do for the rest of the game and just beat you to death with this thing, because it is going to snowball out of control. The first turn it deals 4 damage directly to their face if they don't have any blockers. Next turn it deals 5, 6, 7, and just that gets out of hand very, very fast, and I like that. I like that a lot. So I can see that in like an is it tempo shell, this could be very strong. That said, it doesn't have haste. It doesn't natively have haste. I think that is a huge knock against it, because in a lot of situations, you're just going to play this out on 3 and your opponent's just going to blast it immediately. Which hurts. I mean, the dice to removal is not a good reason to prevent, or not a good reason to stop playing a card, but the fact that this dies to removal without giving you any value upon entering the battlefield or dying is really the part that hurts. You have to attack with it. If you can enable attacking with this by either protecting it long enough or giving it haste, I think this card's going to be really good. If you can't do one of those two things, it's probably going to underperform for you. And that's a shame, because it's a cool design. Yeah, so I think the card is decent. If you're running red aggro, it's probably worth a shot. If you have haste enablers, give it a go. Or, like I said, an is it tempo shell could be really interesting. This alongside Delver as your big threats or something. I don't know. Like, something like that could be very strong. Maybe. We'll see. I'm intrigued. Anyway, so that's Bellows Breath Ogre. What else we got? Next up is, and this is our first mythic of the day. So we are on to the mythics. That is through the rares. Now, you will notice we do have a lot of rares. That is not an accident. And that is, well, when we started this video, I promised I wasn't going to talk about the economy. I'll leave it at that. We have a lot of rares in this set. Anyway, moving on to the mythics. We have a handful of those. Sabai Siphoner. It is 2 blue for a 2/2 with flash. This spell costs 2 less to cast if there are no instant or sorcery cards in your hand. When Sabai Siphoner enters the battlefield, return target instant or sorcery card from your graveyard to your hand. And if Sabai Siphoner would die, shuffle it into your library instead. This is interesting for a couple of reasons. Its last ability, now as a Reanimator player, I definitely need to call out that last ability that says, if it would die, shuffle it into your library instead. I want to be able to loop this out of my graveyard, and this isn't going to let me, which is unfortunate. Unless we're running a mill plan and we mill it away. And then we can reanimate it and do some shenanigans that way. All right, cool. Perfect situation. We don't have any instants or sorceries in our hand, and this is a 2/2 for 2 with flash. That's good. That's not great, but it's not bad. It's a human ninja that we can flash in at an instant speed for 2 mana. Great. And then when it enters the battlefield, we get to return an instant or sorcery from our graveyard to your hand. This is an interesting situation where it is a relevant creature if we don't have any instants or sorceries in the deck, because it becomes a 2/2 flash for 2. If we have so what we really want to do here is have some instants and sorceries, but not very many, because if we have too many, we're going to have something in our hand when it comes time to cast this thing, and it's going to be a 2/2 for 4 with flash, which isn't really that good. That said, if it's a 2/2 for 4 that's getting us back our Emergent Ultimatum that our opponent countered, then all of a sudden that could give us a card that says 7 mana, you win the game. All right, that's worth it. So in that situation, it's probably still worth it. I think this is a decent card in a situation where we want to get some kind of big spell back. It could be very, very good. I think this is going to be best in mid-range decks that have some instants and sorceries, but not a ton. I think that's where we're going to really see it shine. Or in decks that are relying on instants and sorceries to do combo shenanigans. To be honest, this one, I think this one at rare would be 100% worth it, and mythic is probably worth it, is where I would put this. If you're in a situation, this is going to see some, I wouldn't be surprised if this gets nerfed. That's my initial take on it, because this being able to get back unexpected windfalls or galvanic iterations that could then be looped again for more value, or getting back Discover the Formula could be absolutely brutal. Like, that could be a back-breaking blow to your opponent, which is pretty fantastic. So I think this is going to see play in control decks. This is going to see play in mid-range decks. I think Sabai Siphoner is going to be just a very strong card that sees a lot of play. It's that simple. And on top of that, if you don't have any, also actually in a control deck, okay, here's the perfect situation, right? You're playing control, you're out of counters in your hand, you're holding nothing but lands and one Sabai Siphoner. Your opponent doesn't know that. They see a grip of 4 cards. Or you only have 1 card in your hand, and it's this guy. Your opponent casts a spell. You then throw Sabai Siphoner out. It only costs you 2, so you get a 2/2 flash for 2, and you then can pull up a whatever counter spell out of your graveyard and then use that or whatever removal spell you need to respond to what they're doing. So that actually could be very powerful. I mean, Sabai Siphoner, it kind of gives you your whole graveyard. I mean, this is almost like a fixed Leer or like a nerfed Snapcaster Mage. It's kind of what we end up with. I think it's very strong. I think this card could be very, very good. Yeah, I think it's really good. I don't know what else to say. All that said, for me personally, I'm probably not going to craft this card. And the only reason for that is I'm not playing a lot of control decks at the moment. And my Mythic Wild, and I don't have that many Mythic Wild cards. If I was sitting on a dozen Mythic Wild cards that I wasn't quite sure what to do with, I'd craft some of these and give it a try. But since I'm sitting on like 2, I'm probably not going to. If I craft some in packs though, I might try to brew around it and see what we can do. Because I think this could be, I think this card's great. Is really what it comes down to. I think it's very, very strong. All right, next up, we have Moth Rider Cavalry. This is another Mythic for 2 white, which is a 2/2. The spell costs 2 less to cast if you have no other creature cards in hand, and if you have, or if the only other creature cards in your hand are named Moth Rider Cavalry. It's a 2/2 flyer that says other creatures you control get +1/+1. So it's an Anthem effect on a 2/2 flyer that could come down for as cheap as 2. I think, so this is clearly part of a cycle. I think the Moth Rider Cavalry and the guy we were just looking at, whose name is already escaping me, the Saboteur, I believe. Anyway, regardless, these cards are very, very interesting in that you are given a mana reduction for being out of gas. You clearly want to have creatures in the deck with Moth Rider Cavalry because it buffs creatures. But if you have creatures in your hand, Moth Rider Cavalry is a 2/2 flyer for 4 with that Anthem effect on it, which isn't great. Like, it's not bad, but it's not great. It's just kind of meh. And you don't want your mythics to be meh. That's just never where you want it to be. But a 2/2 for 2, 2 white, that gives other creatures you control +1/+1 is awesome. So this, alongside cards like Wedding Announcements, cards like Lolth, cards that are not creatures themselves but create creature tokens, excellent. Now we're talking. That is a situation where Moth Rider Cavalry has an opportunity to really, really sing and really, really shine. I like that. I like it when my cards sing and shine. So we want to put it in a situation where we can go wide with minimal creature cards in the deck. That is really where we want to be. Also, if we can copy Moth Rider Cavalry in one way or another, we can do some shenanigans with that, which could be great, whether we're working Orvar or any of the other copy cards that we were looking at today, actually. So, because being able to give all other creatures +1/+1 is an effect that we want it to have in redundancy. We want to have as many of those as we possibly can. So, that's good. I don't know what else to say. This card is good if you're running creatures, but you don't want it in a situation where you have too many creatures. So like in mono white aggro, this would actually be kind of a downgrade over a lot of the cards that it already has, because that deck is primarily creatures, or at least there's a critical mass of creatures in that deck already that this would be at odds with. But it's a cool card. I think this is a neat design. I like it. But yeah, so if you're running tokens, if you're running like an Orzhov token strategy or a Mardu token strategy right now, yes, you want this card. I don't know what else to tell you, but yeah, you want this card. But that said, one other caveat before we move on to the next card. It does require 2 white. So in a 3-color deck, that may not be ideal. So unless you are primarily white, or white is one of your primary colors. So that's something to keep in mind. But in all, I think the card is quite strong. All right, next up, we have Forgeborn Phoenix. This is 1 red for a 2/2 flying equipment creature. It's an equipment Phoenix. And whenever I see Phoenix as a creature type, I'm listening, because that means we're going to do some graveyard shenanigans. I love me some graveyard shenanigans. So this is a 2/2 flyer for 3. Equipped creature has flying. Nice. Being able to give flying on equipment is always good. Whenever Forgeborn Phoenix or an equipped creature dies, it perpetually gains whenever an equipped creature you control deals combat damage to a player or planeswalker. Return this card from your graveyard to the battlefield tapped. So what that means is, Forgeborn Phoenix, you throw Forgeborn Phoenix on a creature. You attack with that creature. Your opponent blocks. The creature dies. Then, upon dying, so like, let's say, actually, I think this card's great too. I came into this set review with the expectation of saying that Alchemy is not worth your time. But the more I look at these cards, the more I like them. And Forgeborn Phoenix is an example of that. So the equipped creature gets flying, so it gives an equipped creature evasion, and then it gives you a payoff for punching your opponent in the face with an equipped creature. That's great. so what we did, so with Forgeborn Phoenix, we can do a couple of things. Perfect situation, we put that on a creature with a cool death trigger or a cool enter the battlefield trigger. We then attack with the Forgeborn Phoenix, or or the equipped creature, I should say. If it dies in combat, okay, it happens. If it doesn't, the creature goes into the graveyard with this ability on it, or whenever it dies, we can sacrifice it. It can die in combat, any number of reasons, or your opponent can hit it with a kill spell, whatever. This protects it by giving it recursion, because then Forgeborn Phoenix can then attach to another creature. So you have to have another creature online. Which is noteworthy. So you attach the Forgeborn Phoenix to another creature, give that creature flying, hit your opponent with it, which hopefully goes through because the creature has flying. If it does successfully go through, the creature that died previously then all of a sudden comes back. I think that there are some hoops to jump through, which is definitely problematic, but the Forgeborn Phoenix does enable itself in a cool way. So it's kind of... This card feels like a one-card combo, which is kind of fun. Like, this is the kind of thing you see in a lot of Commander products that I wouldn't expect to see in an Alchemy release. But, I mean, except for the Perpetual. That obviously can only be Alchemy. But I think this is interesting. The fact that it gives recursion to another creature. Also, the card that is attacking, or the card that strikes the opponent has to be equipped. It does not have to be equipped with Forgeborn Phoenix. So... there's already a deck I can think of. I have a Boros equipment deck in Historic right now that is loosely modeled after Modern Hammer Time. I'm going to put Forgeborn Phoenix in that deck as soon as I get my hands on a couple copies, because that deck has a lot of equipped creatures, and it has a lot of creatures that I want to recur from the grave, that I don't want to die, and I'm already running Call the Forgemaster in that deck as a way of protecting equipped creatures. Now all of a sudden Forgeborn Phoenix gives me a way to recur creatures as long as I have equipped creatures. So I think if you're running equipment and you have red in your deck, Forgeborn Phoenix is definitely worth considering. I think it's actually a really cool card. Yeah, I think it's cool. So far, all the mythics we've looked at are pretty solid in their own respective archetypes. Yeah, that's Forgeborn Phoenix. Next up, Forceful Cultivator. I have a feeling this one is gonna maybe not be the same. All right, so it is a 2/3 for 2 green. The spell costs 2 less to cast. You guessed it, if there are no land cards in your hand. When Forceful Cultivator enters the battlefield, search your library for a basic land card, put that card onto the battlefield tapped, then shuffle. So I'm trying to think of a situation in which I want to be casting a 2/3 for 2 that's going to draw me a land. I want to cast that in a ramp deck where it's really important I hit all my land drops. If I'm in a situation where I'm in a ramp deck and if I am playing a ramp deck and I only have 2 lands in my hand, that makes this card cost, if it's turn 2 and I'm able to cast Forceful Cultivator for 2, something has gone horribly, horribly wrong. That is a situation that I do not want to be in. Because it guarantees that I ramp once, which could be fine, but what happens after that? So on turn 2, I get 3 land down, but I'm guaranteed to not have any other land in my hand. So I'm depending on top decking land or some kind of card draw spell or an Adventurous Impulse or something that can get me into more land. I don't like it. Yeah, I don't like this card at all, frankly. I would rather run more land in my deck than run Forceful Cultivator. That's kind of where I'm at. What is the benefit of having Forceful Cultivator in my deck over a Forest? To be honest, it's not great. Like, the situation is just not calling for it. I don't think this card is worthy of a mythic. I just don't. Being able to keep sketchy 2-land hands is something that I want to be able to do, but what's the cost? I don't want to have 4 cards in my deck that are dead, or not dead, but not good. I don't want to have 4 really bad Quandrix Cultivators in my deck just to have the off chance of being able to keep a 2-land hand. I think this card is not great. I may be proven wrong on that, because if it's not worth casting for 4, you don't want to keep this. Like, the cost reduction effect on this one is just not good enough, I don't think. The cost of having no lands in your hand is too high. Yeah, I don't like Forceful Cultivator very much at all, frankly. Yeah, which is a shame, because so far the other mythics that we've seen have actually been pretty good. But it's an interesting design space. It's an interesting situation. But I can't think of a situation where this card does what you want it to do, and I'm not already really far behind. Like, this is... I would rather mulligan down to 6 than have to keep a hand with Forceful Cultivator in it. Anyway, so that's Forceful Cultivator. That was a bit of a downer. What's our last card? The last one that we're going to look at. Let's see how it goes. And it is Consuming Onai. This is a 6/6 Ogre Demon for 2 black. That is a 6/6 Flying Menace Ogre Demon, that is, for 4. At the beginning of your end step, a random non-land card in your hand perpetually gains when you cast a spell, you lose 3 life. I love this card. I love it. I want all of it. I need this in my life immediately. So the cost behind this card is very real. The fact that when you cast spells that are, so when Consuming Onai is on the battlefield, at your end step, a card in your hand basically becomes cursed. That if you were to cast that spell, you lose 3 life. Notably, if I'm not mistaken, this can hit the same card twice, or 3 times, or like any number of times. So if Consuming Onai is on the battlefield and you only have 2 other cards in your hand, or only 1 other card, let's say Nightmare Scenario, you have 1 non-land card in your hand, Consuming Onai is on the battlefield, boom, that card gets, it perpetually costs 3 less, or you lose 3 life the moment you cast it. All right, that sucks. You definitely don't want to do that. But next turn, okay, you swing with the Consuming Onai, it hits for 6 because it's a Flying Menace 6/6. The chances are it's going to get through in combat. And that's swinging as early as turn 5. Love it. It's absolutely fantastic. Add Goblin Ringleader to the mix. This can be swinging on turn 4. My goodness, that's very powerful. So that's great. But you have this Nightmare Scenario where you have this 1 card in your hand. It gets you lose 3 life when you cast it. Now, if you then cast that the next turn, you take a hit to the face. Kind of hurts, but you've gotten your value. You have a very big creature that's swinging consistently, providing a lot of pressure on the board. Or it pulled a removal spell from your opponent. Okay, that's a fine situation too. It's notable in a situation where you're looking at a card and you think, well, my opponent's just going to kill it, so is it very good? If your opponent has to spend a removal spell on it, it's a good card. If they have the removal and they have to spend it on that card, then you probably want to consider it. And this is one of those situations. If your opponent has the removal, they will target this because they have to. Otherwise, they're going to die really fast. This is at its best in a traditional aggro deck where you want to have all your cards on the table as fast as humanly possible. This is like turn 1 Rabbit Battery, turn 2 2 1-drops, turn 3 double spell again, turn 4 Consuming Onai, your hand is empty, the board is full, slam. Like that's what you want to be doing with this. Like you want to be swinging for the fences as fast as humanly possible, because if the Consuming Onai is left on the battlefield unchecked for multiple turns and you are allowed to keep multiple cards in your hand that whole time, they're going to become more and more difficult to cast, if not impossible to cast, because if 1 card gets hit 3 times, you have to lose 9 life to cast it. That's unplayable, in my opinion. Like that makes that card unplayable. So that's a very real cost that you need to be aware of, that you need to navigate. This is the kind of card that I want to see in black, because black, the color identity of black is power at any cost. This provides a lot of power, but at a very real cost, unless you build your deck around it so that cost is mitigated. I think that's really cool. I love the design on this, and I think it's worth a mythic. I think this card is great. So final impressions of the alchemy cards. I gotta say, 1, thank you so much for getting this far into the video. I know it's been a long one, but I appreciate it very, very much. It means the world. And if you got this far, please like and subscribe to the channel. It makes a huge difference. Also, just thank you for being you. Keep it up. Final impressions of this alchemy set. I wish there was a cost-effective way to get your hands on it, but as of this recording, that doesn't really exist. Wildcards are expensive. Well, we can't even buy wildcards directly. We have to crack packs for them. And in this, as of this recording, I know there is a stream scheduled for after this recording to discuss the arena economy. Hopefully some changes come out of that. But if they don't, the only way to get your hands on these cards is to buy packs in the store. And packs are 1,000 gold each, or I believe it's, I want to say 300 gems, or it's 500 gems for 3. Or anyway, they're expensive. They're very expensive to get your hands on a lot of them, and that is unfortunate. Because we don't all have hundreds of dollars burning holes in our wallets. If you do, God bless you, enjoy it, have fun with these cards. But if you're like me and you don't, well, we'll do what we can, and you got to pick and choose which ones you want to take advantage of based on what archetypes you enjoy playing. Like Consuming Onai, I like black aggro, so I'm probably going to run this card. I'm probably going to craft this. And like I mentioned, there are a few other cards. Like Kami of Mourning sounds like a really cool, interesting build around that I want to try. I don't know if it's very good or not, but I want to try it. yeah, so thank you so much for tuning in. I appreciate you. If you want to see more videos like this, let me know in the comments below. And also, please smash that bell icon so you can get notified whenever I upload a new video. I would really appreciate it. So thank you so much. But I guess the bottom line question is this alchemy set worth buying? If you want to play alchemy or you are heavily invested in historic, probably. If you're not, though, just pass. And that's okay. Yeah. All right. I'll catch you on the next one. Thanks, everybody.